Time now to talk politics. We are going to talk about the life and legacy of Dale Bumpers. I am joined by Dr. Jay Barth. He's a professor of political science at Hendrix College, and Political Animals Club President Rex Nelson, who was also the political editor for the Arkansas Democrat Gazette back in the day when there was a lot to cover in those politics up in Washington. Welcome to both of you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you.
Jay, I'm going to let you go first. I want you to tell me a little bit about Dale Bumpers and just kind of how did he rise from obscurity to win this primary that propelled him to the governorship and really launched his political career in a day and age where we couldn't imagine somebody getting a 1% and coming onto the scene like he did.
Well, I think Bumpers was such a transitional figure in Arkansas politics, and that he was really the first guy to use television media in particular to really go from essentially zero to winning a series of elections over political giants. And that started with, taking $100,000 to DeLoss Walker, the TV guy in Memphis, making these ads with him really talking straight to the camera. And that is what propelled him forward in a very crowded field. But he had the kind of charisma to play well on television. But it was a transitional period because he still also had to go out and do stump speaking and go to these diners and all this kind of stuff. And so he had to have a kind of core authenticity about him. And he developed that brand of a belief in public service and a real sense that government could do right by people that really was the thread throughout his political career. But he was that great combo of doing it well on TV, but then also still performing well one-on-one.
Yeah, he was a great retail politician. But you got to see him in action on the Senate floor, too. You got to see him out in the campaign field as well, covering him. Your impressions in that
I can't tell you the number of times, Roby, that I would go with him to a civic club meeting in Arkansas, and he would walk in and they'd be mad about him about, quote unquote, giving away the Panama Canal or some vote or another. And with 15 minutes, invariably, they'd be laughing, slapping each other on the back. Good old Dale, he was their best friend. And he had that ability. They would be eating out of the palm of his hand. So Jay hit on it. He had the ability on television, but he also had the old style Arkansas one-on-one ability to go up, talk to people, to talk to civic club groups and win them over. He was an amazing politician.
Yeah, now you saw him in the Senate quite a bit in action too, and I know that from some of the people that I have talked to, they used to come out of their offices to watch Dale Bumpers speak on the U.S. Senate floor. That doesn't happen.
Oh, no, it doesn't happen, but he's one of the all-time great orators. I'm biased. I had the pleasure of covering him every day for 4 years when I was the Washington correspondent for the Arkansas Democrat in the 1980s, but you're exactly right. When Dale Bumpers would wind up and give a speech, people would come out, and one of my most memorable moments was that night late in the session, right before the recess in 1988, when he basically prevented development of land adjoining the Manassas battlefield in northern Virginia. And Bumpers, as you know, would later tell people that was one of his proudest moments in the U.S. Senate. Not a big national story, but his oratorical ability turned the issue that night.
Back in the day when the decision wasn't made before the speeches came on the floor there, they would deliberate actually in the U.S. Senate. So what do you think was his defining moment in terms of history? Obviously everybody's talked about the Clinton speech, Jay, but at the same time, I mean, integrating the Charleston School District, the speech that you just talked about, Rex, there's a lot of things that you could point to that were definitive in Dale Bumpers' career.
Yeah, I think the defining moment in Arkansas politics was the defeat of Orville Faubus and the way in which that morphed into really carrying out the Rockefeller agenda in that first legislative session, 1971, which I think almost anybody would say was the most productive legislative session Arkansas has ever had. I mean, big stuff on reorganization of the government, on kindergarten, on textbooks, on moving forward on the vaccine program. I mean, just a whole series of big
taxes
and the major tax increase, of course, to fund a lot of these efforts. I mean, that was transformative in terms of modernizing state government. So he both modernized politics by moving Arkansas away from the Faubus era, the Democratic Party in particular, away from the Faubus era, but he also modernized government. And he was the great modernizer in a lot of sense, and using technology in a very important long way to propel that along.
I would go as far as saying Winthrop Rockefeller and Dale Bumpers were the two top figures in Arkansas history in the 20th century. Rockefeller started us into that new era, into that progressive era, but he couldn't get things passed through a heavily Democratic legislature. He laid the groundwork, and then Dale Bumpers came in, being a Democrat, of course, and actually got those things passed. Those two working in tandem during that 8-year period changed Arkansas forever.
Yeah, maybe Bill Clinton would disagree with you on that. Look, we're going to take a, we've got to end the show here, but you guys stick around. We're going to go online for a little extended conversation. Y'all do that with me?
Sure.
All right, Jay Barth and Rex Nelson, thanks. That's all for this week's edition of Talk Business and Politics. Check out our web extra online at talkbusiness.net. That's all for our on-air program at this time. Have a busy and a productive week. We'll see you next time. And welcome back to our Web Extra. I'm joined by Dr. Jay Barth at Hendrix College, Rex Nelson with the Political Animals Club. We are talking about Dale Bumpers, his life, his legacy. I want each of you, we ran out of time on air, but I want to hear each of you maybe tell a little bit of a personal story of how you interacted with Dale Bumpers. Jay, I'll let you go first.
Well, I think it's important to contextualize the fact that, you know, the Bumpers organization, the Clinton organization, the Pryor organization, they were separate organizations. They were all Democrats, but they were very separate. And you had folks that were really loyalist to one of those three, and they overlapped in a way that really prevented the Republican onslaught that was really coming across the region from happening in Arkansas. And so I think that's an important thing. And they had very different styles, and they had very different relationships. And what I would, really, I had relationships, interactions with the senator across time, but I had a lot more interactions with folks who were staffers to him, and the loyalty of those staffers to Senator Bumpers is just something that I think is probably both exceptional and something that we're not going to see moving forward, in that, folks are, I think now, who are working for politicians see it as a job. I think the relationships that he had with his staffers, something that was just much more of a personal calling and a relationship that is pretty distinctive, and we're not going to be seeing that in years to come.
Rex, how about you?
Well, the years I spent in Washington for the Arkansas Democrat, I look back on it as kind of a golden era. Reporting was not as easy then because it was pre-internet and pre-cell phone, so it was the old shoe leather reporting. I mean, I was literally in all 6 Arkansas congressional delegation offices every day because the newspaper war had heated up. You didn't want to get beat by the Gazette on everything. But I call it a golden era because there would be those frequent afternoons when maybe it was a little slow on the floor, and either Dale Bumpers or David Pryor would say, just come on in and let's visit off the record. And to be able to sit there and listen to their stories, both of them, it just really increased my knowledge of Arkansas history, Arkansas politics, 2 very different political styles, and yet they complemented each other so well, and they were such great figures in Arkansas history. They really complemented each other well and gave us a strong Senate delegation during those years I was there.
I still have a childhood memory, and it's one of my earliest childhood memories, and it's one of the first, it is the first political memory that I can recall. I was 4 going on 5 years old. It was the 1970 governor's race, and we were visiting some friends up in northeast Arkansas, and I got pushed up to the front of a crowd to shake Dale Bumpers' hand. It was at the Clay County Fairgrounds, and my father said, shake this man's hand, he's going to be the next governor. Wow. And I can still visually remember that. It's one of my earliest memories there, and so I've always recalled that in thinking about Dale Bumpers all these years.
Yeah, and I think about the 74 Senate race between him and Fulbright, which really divided families, Democratic families, in a unique way. And you had spouses voting on different sides of that race, and people who really, it was tough to get over for a while. So, while with Pryor and Clinton, they did a great job of really unifying the party, that race itself was a pretty darn divisive race, because you had 2 folks who, from a lot of markers, were really pretty heroic from the Democratic Party perspective, but they went at each other, and it wasn't pretty.
And you had seen the McClellan-Pryor race divide Democratic families in the same way just 2 years before that. So it was really a time when these young guns. The Dale Bumpers and the David Pryors were kind of to replace the old guns on the Arkansas scene.
Yeah.
And then eventually, of course, Dale Bumpers becomes an old gun. But in the process, we talk about beating Faubus, we talk about beating Rockefeller, we talk about beating Fulbright. Those were great Arkansas figures of the past when he beat them. But along the line, then he came back as an older senator and beat Mike Huckabee and Asa Hutchinson, both of whom would go on to become governors of Arkansas. He beat all 5 of those figures in his career.
That's a full house, isn't it?
Really is.
And I think in retrospect, his destruction of Huckabee was perhaps the most impressive, because the state was beginning to shift a little bit, and Huckabee early on showed some real spiritedness in that race, and then Bumpers just really demolished him. Obviously with the help of the president at the top of the ticket, but he used the Second Battle of Manassas ad very effectively, and really responded effectively to Huckabee's social critique of him. Really trying to use social issues and basically trying to call Bumpers a pornographer, and Bumpers just really thwacked back at him.
Well, if you had asked me in the mid-1980s who would be the first president from Arkansas, I would have told you Dale Bumpers and not Bill Clinton. Dale Bumpers came very close to seeking the Democratic nomination several times. The first time was in 1976. Yeah. He was only in his 2nd year in the Senate, and who knows, that young Southern president might have been Dale Bumpers instead of Jimmy Carter. And then he came very close again when I was covering him in the '88 election cycle, but decided in '87 that he would not seek the nomination. I can remember vividly Roby taking the train with his press secretary, Matt James, up to New York to cover a foreign policy speech at Columbia University. Now, when you start giving foreign policy speeches, you're running for president, right? You're trying to burnish your credentials in that area. And I think maybe in his mind, at that point in '87, he was running for president, but ultimately decided not to make the run. That was the so-called 7 dwarfs that ran as Democrats that year. Michael Dukakis came out of the field, of course, lost to George H.W. Bush. And again, I'll always wonder what would have happened had Dale Bumpers run.
Yeah, there's a great story that someone tells about how Dale Bumpers has often said, my dad would be rolling over in his grave if he knew I'd passed not just once on running for president, but twice. He'd have been very disappointed.
Absolutely.
In him, so.
It would have been interesting to see. We will never know, but I think either time he could have well been the Democratic nominee.
Well, great memories. I appreciate you guys sharing, and we need to wrap things up here and move it on, but thanks you as always. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right. That's all for our Web Extra. You can keep up with all of the latest business and political news each and every day at talkbusiness.net.